أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Amma ba'd, before we continue, and this week inshallah we speak about the explicit and implicit divorce. And when a person says to his wife, you are divorced clearly, yani anti talaq, or you are divorced, or when they say it in a roundabout way, where they say something and they intend by divorce. Like for example, get out of the house. And the intention by saying get out of the house is that she is divorced. He says, Rahimahullah, باب صريح الطلاق وكنايته صريحه لفظ الطلاق وما تصرف منه كقوله أنت طالق أو مطلقة أو طلقتك. The explicit word of divorce is talaq, or those derived from it, such as you are taliq, okay, these are obviously in the Arabic language, or you are mutallaqa, or I divorce you, talaqtuki. If a person says to his wife that you are divorced, whether he intended it or not, whether he was joking or he was serious, she is divorced. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ, he said, ثلاث جدهن جد وهزلهن جد النكاح والطلاق والرجعة. Three matters. When you are serious about them, it is serious, and when you are joking about them, it is also serious. Marriage, divorce, and the taking back of the divorced woman. So there is no mucking around when it comes to divorce. A person can't say to his wife, babe, guess what? What? Anti taliq. Ha ha ha, what a funny joke. No, that divorce has happened. A person can't say, but Sheikh, I was joking. That's your fault. This is not a matter to be joking around about at all. On top of the fact that it is very emotionally hard on the woman. And obviously we've mentioned many times, many of the Islamic rulings came for the protection of the woman, her finances, her emotions, her physical state, etc. But also this is not something good for social cohesion, beginning in the house and then outside. Divorce is something big. And just like we said last week, if a man divorces his wife 3 times, then the only way for them to get back together is for her to marry a proper marriage, someone else, and then if they get divorced, then she can go back to the first husband. This is not something to be played around with. It's something serious. So whether a person is joking or serious, the divorce falls. This is if the talaq is given clearly and directly, whether it is in Arabic or it is in another language. So if a person says in English to his wife, I divorce you, or you are divorced, or anything along those lines where it is clear, then that woman is divorced. Anyone? Where's our Urdu speakers? They're gone? We don't have other special languages here. They're all Arab speakers. Khalas. Brother, Turkish? How do you say to your wife in Turkish you're divorced?
If you say like this, bosho,
Bosh? Bosho. So if you're a Turkish man, I hope you're telling me the right thing and I'm not embarrassing myself. If, for example, a person's Turkish, he says to his wife, Bosho, that's it. Or if you understood, you watch too many Turkish TV shows, and you hear the man say to his wife, in a Bosho, and you now say to your wife, Bosho, as a joke, khalas, she's divorced. Now, so if you are saying you're divorced in any language, and you know what you are saying, and it is explicit, then in this case, she is divorced. فَمَتَى أَتَى بِهِ بِصَرِيحِ الطَّلَاقِ طَلَقَتْ وَإِنْ لَمْ يَنْوِهِ. Whenever he speaks an explicit word of talaq, she becomes immediately divorced, even if he did not intend it. وَمَا عَدَاهُ مِمَّا يَحْتَمِلُ الطَّلَاقَ فَكِنَايَةٌ لَا يَقَعُ بِهِ الطَّلَاقُ إِلَّا أَنْ يَنْوِيَهُ. As for that which is besides this explicit, the word of divorce, and all the implicit wordings that could mean divorce, it will be treated as a metaphor, and their ultimate interpretation will depend on the person's intention. So if he said, as we mentioned, for example, to his wife, get out of the house, maybe he meant divorce, maybe he didn't. Get out of the divorce, maybe he just wanted to kick her out and he was angry with her. We're not saying it's right or wrong, we're saying, what did he intend? Just kick her out of the house, or did he mean by it, you're divorced? If he says, khalas, pack up your bag, go to your mom's house, what did he mean by it? Did he mean you're divorced, or did he mean just go to your mom's house, I'm angry, I don't want to see you? If he says, I don't want to see you for the rest of my life, what did he mean by it? All of these words, which could mean divorce or could not mean divorce. Maybe this, maybe that. We don't say it's automatically divorced unless the person intended it. Tayyib. Who's going to tell you about what the person intended? The person himself. The person himself. So if there's ever a doubt, let's say the wife calls the sheikh and says, Sheikh, my husband told me to get out of the house, am I divorced or not? The sheikh has to call the husband and ask, what did you intend by it? If he tells you, I meant by it divorce, then obviously the divorce falls. But if he just said, Sheikh, I was angry and I just didn't want to see her, I just wanted her to go to her mom's house, cool off for 2-3 days, and then we'll get back together inshallah like normal. And obviously that's not divorce. It's not a very good healthy way of dealing with things Islamically, but it doesn't mean divorce. فلو قيل له ألك امرأة قال لا ينوي الكذب لم تطلق وإن قال طلقتها طلقت وإن نوى الكذب. If a man is asked, do you have a wife? And he says no, intending to lie, she does not become divorced. Why? Don't start with intention.
No, he didn't mean.
Don't start with the intention. There's something before the intention here. If a man was asked, do you have a wife? And he said no, and he intended a lie, he's not divorced. Why?
Because he didn't say divorce.
Very good. Allah Barik. He's the faqih. Ahsan. What's your name? Muhammad. Ahlan wa sahlan Muhammad. Make sure you choose the Hamli method. Okay? Correct. The action here is before the divorce. If he says you're divorced, it doesn't matter what his intention is. So we don't first look at the divorce, we look at the action. He didn't say she's divorced. He said, no, I don't have her. And he's intending by it a lie. So he didn't say it. What does he mean by it? He didn't mean divorce, he just meant a joke, a lie. It's haram for lying, but it doesn't mean divorce. As for if he said, I divorce her, she becomes divorced even if he was lying. And even if he was just saying it as a joke. Why, Ya Muhammad? If he said she's divorced, even if he was joking, why is she divorced?
Because he said it.
Good. And doesn't matter what her intention is?
Doesn't matter.
Good. Ahsan. It doesn't matter what his intention is. وإن قال لامرأته أنت خلية أو برية أو بائن أو بتة أو بتلة ينوي طلاقها طلقت ثلاثا إلا أن ينوي دونها وما عدا هذه يقع به واحدة إلا أن ينوي ثلاثا. And if he says to his wife, you are khaliya or bariya, these are all different terms in Arabic to mean completely separated. You and I are completely separated. Intending to divorce her, she becomes divorced 3 times unless he intended less than that. Aside from that, the divorce will always count as a singular divorce unless he intends a composite 3-fold divorce. And we spoke previously that the majority of the fatwa, not the majority, a lot of the fatwa that you will find implemented is that the 3 divorces are one. Okay, and this is why it's important to understand consistency in fatwa. In the opinion that 3 equals 1, then if he said this, then it's going to equal 1. On the fatwa that 3 equals 3, then it's going to equal 3. Okay, so it's important to have that consistency in fatwa. This next point is very important. وإن خير امرأته فاختارت نفسها طلقت واحدة وإن لم تختر أو اختارت زوجها لم يقع شيء. قالت عائشة لماذا عائشة وليس عائشة؟ خطأ مطبعي. أحسنت. ممنوع من الصرف. For the names of women in Arabic, you never becomes tanween. Never becomes tanween. Aisha too. Fatima too. Okay, you won't find the tanween on it. And the same with the male names that are written in the form of a female. يعني بتاع مربوطتين. Like Osama, Talha, etc. It will not have a tanween on it. طيب. قالت عائشة رضي الله عنها قد خيرنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم And so they said, أَفَكَانَ طَلَاقًا. If he gives his wife the choice and she chooses separation, she is divorced one time. This word separation, I don't like. Okay? I don't like. Only because some people misinterpret what separation means Islamically and what divorce is Islamically. If they mean by it separation, mean they are married but they're just not living together. Maybe they've had a fight, maybe there's issues, maybe they live in separate countries, and so they are still married Islamically, but they are just not on talking terms, or they have issues, and so they are separated from one another. That Islamically means nothing. That Islamically means nothing. And this is important. Why? Because we get asked a lot. Sheikh, a couple were separated and divorced. A couple were separated and living in different countries for 2 years. And now they want to get divorced. Does the woman still have to do her iddah? What is the answer? Yes. Okay, why? Because that separation means nothing Islamically. The only time the separation is part of a discussion is the nafaqah still an obligation or not? Is the man still responsible for covering the cost of that woman? The roof of her head, her clothing, her food, etc. This is where the discussion is. What are the duties as a spouse? As for, are they married and the iddah, if they get divorced, etc., then the rules are exactly the same. There's no change there whatsoever. So if he gives his wife the choice and she chooses the separation, here meaning she chooses divorce, then she is divorced one time. And this happens a lot. This is why it's important. This happens a lot. Sometimes there'll be issues between a husband and a wife, and usually in this case the wife has a little bit more of the issue, and so she's complaining to her husband, and her husband says, listen, I can't do anything about it, or I can't change that, or this is how I am, whatever he's going to reply. And so he says, listen, if you want, you can get divorced. I give you the choice. And so now, whatever she chooses falls. If he says to her, you choose, you want divorce, you can get divorced. If you want to stay married, you can stay married. It's up to you. And she says divorce, then that woman becomes divorced. The woman becomes divorced one time. Still, the rules of the normal iddah period apply. If it's a first or second divorce, he can take her back, etc. But nevertheless, she is divorced once. If she does not choose, and he said, do you want to get divorced? And she didn't respond. Or if she chooses to remain with her husband, she says, no, I don't want to get divorced, then no divorce takes place. Just like Aisha anha, when she said the Messenger of Allah gave us the choice, and she was asked, she asked, was it a choice? And is it a choice? Is it going to be a divorce? And they obviously didn't choose to divorce the Prophet ﷺ. But if they did, it would have been considered a divorce. وليس لها أن تختار إلا في المجلس إلا أن يجعله لها فيها بعده. She is not entitled to choose except in that same session, in that same sitting, unless he gives her the option after that. So if, for example, now they're in a discussion, him and her, they're talking about their problems, he says, listen, I can't do this anymore, it's your choice. Do you want to stay married or get divorced? She has to choose in that moment. Not that second, but in that sitting. If one of them gets up and khalas leaves, they leave the house, they go to sleep, whatever it is, then that's finished. That's finished. Like khiyar al-majlis. Like when you buy something, you have the option to cancel that transaction as long as you are still there. So you go to a shop, you buy a phone. Here's the iPhone, here's 1,500. You're still in the shop, and you say, you know what, man, I regret it, please, I want to cancel it. You're allowed. But if you leave that gathering, you walked out of the shop, you go back into your car, and then he said, you know what, man, my wife's going to kill me when I get home, let me go get that money back. Okay? Now, you don't have the right to cancel it. You can ask him to cancel that transaction and to refund you your money, but it's not an obligation. But in that sitting, as you are there, you have that right to cancel the transaction. So similarly here, if you give the woman the option and she chooses divorce in that moment, you are divorced. As for if that sitting is finished, you went to sleep, she went to sleep, it was a week later, okay, and she didn't choose, she can't come back later on and say, pause, I want to go back to a divorce. This is not allowed. Okay? The exception is if he gave her the option. If he said, listen, you've got a week to think about it. Think about it from now to next week, you can choose. Then if she comes back after 2-3 days and says, I want to get a divorce, then it falls. As for if he said, choose, and he didn't specify, then it's limited to that sitting. If she doesn't choose or she says, I choose you, then you stay married. Okay? Then you stay married. As for if she divorces in that majlis, then obviously you're divorced. My advice is don't ever do that. That's my advice. Okay, you have to be very smart with this. Okay, you have to be very smart with this. Why? Because, like we said previously, the woman is more emotional, and that's why Allah Azza wa Jal gave the divorce in terms of what is verbally done to the man. Because the man is not meant to act of impulse, he's meant to be more controlling of his emotions. So if your wife hates you for something that you've done right now, and you say, listen, you choose, you want to be married or not? 99% of the time she's going to choose what? Divorce. But then the problem is, the next day, she's going to call me, and she's going to say, Sheikh, XYZ happened, I didn't mean it, or I didn't want it, or I regretted it. And I don't like phone calls. So please, don't divorce your wives, don't give her the choice, alright? If it happens, tell her to wait. Say, listen, there's an issue, wait 3-4 days. If you want, then we can discuss it at that time. Jazakumullah khairan. And then call Sheikh Abdul Rahman. وإن قال لها أمرك mistake here. وإن قال لها أمرك بيدك أو طلقي نفسك فهو في يدها حتى يفسخ أو يطاع. If he says your matter is in your hand or divorce yourself, then it is up to her, unless he takes that authorization back or he is intimate with her. Okay? Here, it's clear if he says to her, the matter is up to you. If you want, you can divorce yourself. And then he recants on it and he says, Khalas, yani, I take it back. That's obvious because he verbally stopped the authorization that he gave. Just like if you tell someone you can use my car, and then an hour later you say, listen, bring my car back. It's obvious. But what about the being intimate with her? Why does that stop the authorization for a divorce?
Just like consummation of marriage, like it's the act of getting back together.
I think your intention is correct, but fix your words. I think you're on the right path. Because you're not married, maybe your words will be mixed up.
And it's a sign that he wants to.
Good, ahsant. Okay? It is a sign that, see, Allahumma barik, 1 out of every 34 answers is good. Alhamdulillah, we're getting there, alhamdulillah. It is a sign that the person wants to stay married. Otherwise, he shouldn't have slept with her. Just like we said, if a woman is divorced and she's in an iddah period, the man can either take her back verbally or through an action that is understood to mean that he takes her back. Verbally, he's saying, I take you back. An action like him saying, an action like him being intimate with her. Because it's an obvious sign that he wants to stay with her. Now, this is obviously another example of that. Any questions on anything that we mentioned here?
What is
Before we get to the next thing.
التسريح هو الطلاق ولا هو ايه؟ معنى تسريح بإحسان ده معنى ايه؟
الفراق، نعم. تسريح بإحسان الفراق. يعني صرح، يعني أطلق. يعطيها حقها، لا يشتمها، لا يحرجها، لا يبهدلها في المجتمع، لا يغتابها إلى آخره.
If the husband gives the wife the option to divorce or not.
So just so I can translate, the doctor's asking, when Allah Azza wa Jalla talks about tasrih in the Quran with the sin, بإحسان, with goodness, this is talking about if you get divorced, you get divorced with goodness. And you get divorced properly, you give them their rights, you don't oppress them, you don't talk bad about them, you don't cause issues with the children, etc. Khalas, you separate, but you separate with taqwa, with goodness.
If he gives the wife the option to divorce or not, she doesn't get like her money back or some.
Good question. Allahumma barik. You're on a roll now, ya Mahmoud. Allahumma barik. This is a very good question. If he gives her the choice here, he says the divorce is up to you, and she chooses to get divorced. She says, I want to be divorced. Does she have, is it khula or is it talaq? And why? Why?
Because he gave her the permission.
He gave her the reins.
Same thing with khula.
Because there is no exchange.
Good. Number one condition is there's no exchange. In khula there needs to be an exchange. What is she giving him back? But here there's no exchange, so it can't be khula. So if they both agree on the divorce, then it's automatically divorce. The khula, the husband saying, I don't want to get divorced, but I will in exchange for X, commodity X, amount X. Jayyid? Ahsantum. Any other question about anything that we mentioned on this chapter before we go on to the next one?
You know, you say, so if you say you can't joke about it, I joke to my parents say, oh, I divorced my wife. Even though I'm not joking with her, is that counted?
Another very good question. If a man says anywhere, even by himself in his house, I divorced my wife, she's divorced. Even if he didn't say it to her directly. So sometimes a person may be with his friends and he says, boys, you know my wife? Yeah, she's divorced. Then that woman is divorced. Okay? Or if a person is by himself, you know when people get angry in movies and they go to their room and they start talking to themselves? You know, one day a man has a fight with his wife and he's upset, he goes to his room and he's angry at his wife and he goes, you know what, you're divorced. And he says that, khalas, she's divorced. Even if he said it by himself. Okay? And now Allah Azza wa Jalla is a witness to that and you need to uphold it. Another good question. Yalla, astaghfir Abdul Khaliq. A lot of pressure now.
Now, if he says something like that and then he keeps it to himself, what's the punishment?
He's living in haram, she isn't. He's now living in haram. If he said that she's divorced and he didn't tell her, if it's the first or second divorce, then he can take her back. But if it's the third divorce and now he can't take her back and he's living in haram, then that's on him now. That's on him. Yeah, of course. For him, it's like he's fornicating. And he's oppressing her. Like there's a lot of bad that he's done. Azad. Azad.
What should you do if you like did something like that?
You should tell her. You should tell her, listen, I'm an idiot, but I divorced you. And she's going to say why, and she's going to cry, and you're going to be an idiot sitting there trying to explain to your wife why you divorced her.
No, like you said it on your
And now on top of being divorced, you're going to get bashed too.
No, you said it on your own, but you didn't mean it, but you said like it's still considered divorce.
That's right.
So what should I do?
Go and tell her.
Tell her. I said what?
Yeah, say I'm an idiot.
Okay.
And make sure you've got protection on because you're going to get bashed.
Can you not say that and just say, I take you back?
How questions work, my friend, and I know you know this very well, you put your hand up and then you get chosen. I'm sure you heard that in your 13 years of schooling
You're looking at me.
and then after university.
You're looking at me like son.
Nah, Mahmoud. I'm looking at you because you're a good looking man, Allah barik. Allah Mahmoud.
If someone didn't know about this ruling before, even like if you said it as a joke or whatever, and he was like saying it, does it work? Or?
Another very good question. There are certain things in Islam in which ignorance is allowed and certain things which ignorance is not allowed. One of the things that ignorance is not accepted as an excuse is divorce. It's not accepted as an excuse. Because when you do something, you should know the rulings. And this is not something small, it's not something so intricate, it's something major. It's something major. So if a person says, well, I didn't know, we say sorry. Just like a person can't use the excuse, you know, I didn't know I have to wash my feet in wudu. And you have a million people that you can learn off. Why did you never ask? You needed to know about these rulings. Why didn't you come to the lessons on Wednesday nights? Now you can get fadal.
Do you have to tell her that, oh, I accidentally said I divorced you, like, to myself? Can you just say, I'll take you back? And then she's like, what were you talking about?
Well, you don't even have to tell her that you took her back. So if it's the first or second divorce, you don't have to tell her no. You don't have to tell her if it's the first or second.
بالنسبة للطلاق كل شيء سيريس. طيب بالنسبة للزواج إذا جبنا اللي احنا كنا جروب وقلت لها لوحدة أنا بدي أتجوزك قلت يلا هذا شيخ وهذا هذا بدري شو وتم هذا زواج كمان؟
النكاح نعم، بس ما مع المرأة، لأن المرأة ما بتزوج حالها. بس إذا مثلا مع وليا،
إذا كنا جروب وعم يمزحوا ويضحكوا
ايه مثلا انا قلت لايمن
هذا
مثلا،
الشهود وهذا الشهود
ايه مثلا انا قلت لايمن، انا بدي اتجوز بنتك، وقال لي قبلت وفي شاهدان، خلاص انا متجوز لان هو الولي. بس اذا مع مرأة لا، لان المرأة ما بتجوز حالها. The Hajj is asking about the hadith where we said three matters: them being serious is serious, and their drinking is serious, marriage, divorce, and taking back of the wife. This is also this also counts when it comes to marriage. So if someone made a marriage contract, there's no joking around about it. If someone said, let's just say Mahmoud has a daughter, and I say to Mahmoud, marry me your daughter, and he says yes, he's her wali, he's her guardian. He says yes, and there are two male witnesses that fulfill the conditions, they're married. These things, there's no mucking around in. Very, these things are very serious. Like, there's no mucking around in this matter. And it happens a lot. Like, for example, when someone has a son and someone has a daughter, and they say, Abu Staf, أنا بطلب إيد بنتك لابني. And he says, قبلت. Mr. Fulan, I'm asking for your daughter's hand for my son. And he says, I accept. And there's two male witnesses, خلاص done. It's different if they say, inshallah, بالمستقبل, in the future, maybe them two, like there's a lot of joking around like that, but that's just talking about potential marriage. Potential marriage in the future. That's very different from saying, marry me to your daughter, or I'm asking for your daughter's hand, or a father says to a guy, I marry you to my daughter, etc. Very different. One of the mashaykh in Saudi said, I marry you to my daughter who is not born yet. And there are witnesses. So if the person accepted, does it fall or does not fall, this is a different matter.
المصري يقول علي الطلاق. Does it
هذه من الشروط. هذا التعليق بالطلاق. إن شاء الله في الباب القادم. The conditions, stipulating conditions for divorce is in the upcoming chapter, inshallah.
I still didn't get it. Like, okay, I said it by myself. I go to her. I say to her, sorry, I said it, blah, 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 blah. This is the first time. What I need to do, I just need to say to her, I take you back.
Yeah. You can say to her, or you can say, you don't have to say to her. You can do something. You can, even if you are intimate with your spouse, that's automatically taking her back.
That's hard.
When you get married, inshallah, you talk about it.
إذا البنت بالغة وما لازم الشيخ يسألها يغلطها طبعا إذا ولي ولا
حتى بالشروط، يعني على قول بأن البكر تزوج من قبل أبيها بدون إذنها فخلاص يقع.
ما ضل تكون فيها.
على القول جمهور العلماء.
الأربع مذاهب شيخ
الله أعلم إذا كل المذاهب. إذا كانت بكرا،
البنت إذا هو الشيخ لازم يسألها إذا بدك إياه ولا لا؟
إذا البنت بكر، إذا منها متجوزة من أبا، جمهور العلماء إنه أبوها منه محتاج إذنها. وين قلنا أن الراجح أو الأفضل أنه طبعا يستأذن، طبعا هذا أفضل، بس كثير من العلماء قالوا حتى إذا كانت كبيرة لا منه محتاج إذنها، فحسب الفتوى الموجود.
Take any questions in regards to how?
No, it's after inshallah. But just anything that we mentioned so far.
in the Azad's case, do they need to have like witnesses? Or?
No. Divorce does not need witnesses. It is better to have witnesses, as Allah says in the Quran, but this helps in administrative matters later on. If someone forgot, if someone lies, etc., that's why it's better to have witnesses. But it's not a condition. It's not a condition to have the witnesses for divorce or if he takes her back. It's better, not an obligation. Why what? What do you mean was not an obligation? Because how many times does the man divorce his wife in front of people? Usually, when there's people there, the husband and wife, they're good to each other. When behind closed doors, that's when problems happen, and that's where divorce is usually said. So now, because of the questions, now I ask the question again. Do we continue the next chapter or not? It's going to take again probably about 15 minutes. Yes or no? تفضل دكتور.
Ask someone else.
خلاص, we're going to the next chapter inshallah. He says رحمه الله باب تعليق الطلاق بالشروط. I'll skip over some of the things that need to be mentioned. The chapter on conditional divorce. So this is talking about you are divorced if. Okay, if you do X, Y, Z, you're divorced. What are the rulings regarding it? يصح تعليق الطلاق والعتاق بشروط بعد النكاح والملك. It is valid to make a conditional divorce or emancipation, any freeing of a slave, as long as this happens after marriage or ownership respectfully. Meaning before it doesn't mean anything. If a person says, when I get married, if my wife ever raises her voice, she's divorced. And you're not married yet, it doesn't mean anything. Okay? This only happens, these conditions are only met after marriage. ولا يصح قبله فلو قال إن تزوجت فلانة فهي طالق أو إن ملكتها فهي حرة فتزوجها أو ملكها لم تطلق ولم تعتق. كما هو مكتوب هنا. الله أعلم هذا صحيح. It is not valid before marriage or ownership. For example, if he says, if I marry so-and-so, she is divorced, or if I own so-and-so, she is free, and then he marries her or owns her, she does not become divorced or free. And he says before he said it, doesn't mean anything after when they are divorced. And a lot of people would ask about this. Not a lot of people, sorry, but it's not uncommon. I have been asked about this before. When they engage, for example, and they're talking in the engagement period, and they maybe bring up an issue, like, oh, these people got divorced because she left the house without telling him. And he says, man, if my wife ever left the house without telling me, she's divorced. Okay? That person, when they go now to when they get married, and let's say she left the house without his permission, is she automatically divorced or not? No. Why? Because it happened before the marriage. And the words are only stuck and they're only for after the marriage is done. Amen. Just turn the aircon on. Yeah, I didn't say it. See how noise went? They're guilty. وأدوات الشرط ست إن وإذا وأي ومتى ومن وكلما وليس فيها ما يقتضي التكرار إلا كلما. The injunctions of conditional sentences are 6. This is obviously in Arabic. A person says in, if, either, once, ay, whichever, mata, when, man, whoever, kullama, every time. And none of them indicate repetition except kullama. Meaning, let's just say, stick to English. If a person says conditionally, whatever word he uses, if you leave the house, you're divorced. Meaning, if the woman leaves the house, she becomes what? Divorced. Or when the clock hits 6 o'clock, you're divorced. As soon as they hit 6 o'clock, what happens? She's divorced. Okay? Or for example, she says, he says, whoever, whenever you, so if you ever cook me this meal again, you're divorced. Any word that he uses that is conditional and it happens, then the divorce happens. He says here, the only one though that constantly happens is whenever. The word whenever, kullama, whenever. So if he says, if you leave the house, you're divorced, and she left the house, she becomes what? Divorced. How many times? Once. Okay? So let's say it's the first divorce, then he can take her back. But if he says, every time you leave the house, or whenever you leave the house, you're divorced. So if she leaves the house, what happens? She's divorced. And then next week she left the house again, divorced. And next week left the house again, divorced. Okay? So this is the condition. Some of them are once, and this is the majority of them. And then you have words that they mean every single time, that is considered every single time. وكلها إذا كانت مثبتة ثبت حكمها عند وجود شرطها. فإذا قال إن قمت فأنت طالق فقامت طلقت وانحل شرطه وإن قال كلما قمت فأنت طالق طلقت كلما قامت. For all of them, when used in an affirmative sentence, the consequent takes place upon the occurrence of the condition. For example, if he says, if you stand up, you're divorced, and then she stands up, she becomes divorced. And the conditional statement is no longer operative. Yani khalas. You said it, when you get up, you're divorced, and she got up, that's it, it's finished. like we just gave the example of. However, if he says every time you stand up you are divorced, she becomes divorced every time she stands up. Okay, depending on which word a person uses. The shart and nafiya, okay, how they translate the negative sentence, and if you don't, or if this never happens, this is separate, we'll skip it. Okay, and because it's a little bit hard for, خلاص, let's just say it. وإن كانت نافية كقوله إن لم أطلقك فأنت طالق كانت على التراخي فإذا لم ينوي وقتا بعينه فلا يقع الطلاق إلا في آخر أوقات الإمكان. If he used in a negative sentence, as when he says, if I don't divorce you, you're divorced. If I don't divorce you, you're divorced. Then it will be suspended if he didn't intend a particular time, without the divorce occurring until the last time of possibility, meaning right before the person dies. Just before the person dies, that divorce happens. Okay? This is again just a mental gymnastics for the ulama to understand how things work, and if a case ever comes to you, then you understand how it works. But if he intended a particular time, خلاص, obviously that is divorce. وسير الأدوات على الفور فإذا قال متى لم أطلقك فأنت طالق ولم يطلقها طلقت في الحال. The rest of the conditional clauses, aside from if, will mean immediacy, and it's straight away. For example, if he says, when I don't divorce you, you are divorced, and he does not divorce her, she becomes immediately divorced. And if he said, when I don't divorce you, you're divorced. طيب, 1 second passes. Did he divorce her? No, he didn't divorce her verbally, so she becomes what? Divorced. It's not, inshallah, common, but just so you know how to become muftis. The mufti has to understand scenarios, so he knows when a scenario comes, how to apply it. Okay? Very important to understand wording and the like. Some of the other examples, خلاص, you just leave it. But you get the understanding. Allah, some of the examples are funny because they actually happen in real life.
You read this one, shit?
Whenever you give birth, you're divorced. And then what happens if she gives birth to twins?
She gave birth. When you give birth, you're divorced. She gave birth. Doesn't matter how many times she gave birth.
Yeah, so what happens now when she gives birth to the second baby?
She wasn't taken back.
When you give birth,
Continue, Adam.
She gave birth to the first baby, so now she's divorced. He
Yeah.
hasn't taken her back. So she gave birth outside of any marriage, so she wasn't.
No, Allah yahdik, bro. What kind of a... I thought you were onto something. The child's a haram child?
No, not what I mean. And she got divorced once.
Yes.
And now she's divorced.
What Islamically happens when she gives birth to that second baby?
she's
Nothing. Because she hasn't been brought back.
He hasn't taken back, so what does that mean?
Nothing. She can't be divorced again.
I asked to do another marriage.
خلاص خلاص. They think this is very important. Why? Because Islamically, again, the mufti needs to understand how things work. You need to think outside the box. It's not just always related to divorce. There's things now attached to that divorce. She's pregnant with twins. He says, I divorce you every time you give birth. Okay? So she gave birth. What happens the first time she gives birth to the first baby? Divorce. So what does she get into? A state of what? Iddah. When does the iddah of the pregnant woman finish? When she gives birth. So now, she's still pregnant, sah? The baby came after 5 minutes. What happens to her iddah? It's finished. Her iddah is finished now. So can they get back together simply by him verbally taking her back? He can't take her back just verbally. If they get married, they have to do a new contract. Okay, so you gotta understand. No questions yet, don't worry. Plenty of questions coming, don't worry. Obviously, if a person says something stupid like, whenever you land on the moon, you're divorced, and she never lands on the moon, obviously she's never divorced. But I can see a lot of women, just to get away from their husbands, calling Elon Musk, just trying. Please. طيب, this is a good one. طيب, وإن قال إن حدتي فأنت طالق طلقت بأول الحيض فإن تبين له أنه ليس بحيض لم تطلق وإن قالت قد حدت فكذبها طلقت وإن قال قد حدت فكذبته طلقت بإقراره وإن قال إن حدت فأنت وضرتك طالقتان فقالت قد حدت فكذبها طلقت دون ضرتها. If he says when you menstruate you become divorced, she becomes divorced at the beginning of her menstruation. That one's clean. If it turns out that it was not menstruation, then she is not divorced. Okay, because a woman can bleed obviously other than blood of menstruation. If she says I did menstruate and he contradicts her, meaning he says no you didn't, and he doesn't believe her, she becomes divorced. Why? Because the word happens, that you put the condition and it was clear that she did menstruate. And so if she says I did menstruate and he contradicts her, khalas, doesn't matter, because she actually menstruated, and so she becomes divorced. If he says you menstruated and she contradicts him, she becomes divorced because of his admission. As for the opposite, if she menstruates, so if he says if you menstruate, you're divorced, and she says I didn't menstruate, and he says no you did, then she becomes divorced. Why? Why not the opposite? Good, because the divorce is in his hand. So if he says that you're divorced if you menstruate, and and blood came, and she says it wasn't menstrual blood, and he says no it was, then she's divorced. Why? Because it's his admission. So he has control over the talaq, and so his word is taken. If he says if you menstruate, then you and my other wife are divorced. What's the point of the other wife? Again, this is there for you to have mental gymnastics and to work your brain a little bit. If he says you and my other wife are divorced, and she says I menstruated, but he contradicts her, okay, he contradicts her, he says no you didn't, then only she becomes divorced and not his other wife. Why not the other wife? Because she is saying I had my menstruation and I menstruated, and her word is taken there because it's actually proven that she did. As for the other wife, no, because he doesn't believe it. He put the condition of divorce for the other wife on that menstruation, and he doesn't believe that it happened, and so it doesn't fall. Again, there's a lot of mental gymnastics, but what I wanted to take out of that final paragraph was if a man puts a condition that this wife is divorced, if she does X, Y, Z, and now there's a disagreement as to did X, Y, Z happen. If it actually happened, khalas, like if the husband says to his wife, if you leave the house, you're divorced, and she left the house, khalas, she's divorced. If she says, I didn't leave the house, and he says, no, I know that you left the house, then what happens? She's divorced. Okay, because it's in his hand. Okay, so now she becomes divorced. If she really hates a second wife, and he says, if you leave the house, you and my second wife are divorced, and she just says, yeah, I left the house, just so the other one gets divorced too, and he says, no, I don't believe that you left the house, then the only one to become divorced is the first one, and the second one remains married. Okay, this is just some gymnastics for you guys. Inshallah, you're not too tired, and now we can stop. But in saying that, when it comes to divorce in general, don't make it easy on your tongue, as we have said before. Don't make it easy on your tongue. And some people, actually there's two very important points. Some people, they will say it as a threat. For example, they say to their wife, Wallah, if you leave the house, you're divorced. Wallah, if you leave the house, you're divorced. And they mean it as a threat. Okay, they don't mean it that I'm really going to divorce you, just as a threat. The majority of scholars say it happens, whether you meant it as a threat or not. Why? Because you used the clear word of divorce. You use the clear word of divorce. It's different if a person said, Wallah, if you leave the house, I'm leaving the house. Did he mean divorce or not? Get back to his intention. But when you say the word divorce, then if she leaves, it's divorce. So be very careful. Don't play around with this word. Especially if your wife's emotional. You and your wife had a fight and you make something stupid like that, there's a good chance she's going to do it just because she wants to get at you at that moment. Okay? So don't do that. If he says it even as a joke, okay? Sorry, if he says it even as a threat, naam, or even as a joke, any intention, but he says the word divorce, then it is a divorce. Okay? If she does it, then it is a divorce. So even if it's you said it as a threat, then it still happens. Number two, la ilaha illallah, you cannot take it back. It's also according to the majority of scholars, you can't take it back. So if you say to your wife, if you ever cook this meal again, I'll divorce you. You can't take that back. You can't take that back. So if she ever cooks it again, even if she forgot, sorry brother, you're divorced. Now, and that's why it's very dangerous to use these types of conditions and these types of threats and words. And some people they say, well, if you go to your parents' house ever again, you're divorced. And that means she can't get to her parents' house ever again. So you got to be very, very, very careful. Okay, very careful when it comes to these matters. All right, don't muck around with them. Don't take it lightly. It is something serious and needs to be happen. The third thing, which I'll add, I just remembered as well, alhamdulillah, is that you don't have to say wallah. You don't have to say wallah. This is just a condition. Wallah is not a part of the conditions. So whether a man said, if you leave the house, you're divorced, or he said, wallah, if you leave the house, you're divorced, either way, she is divorced. Okay, it happens. Inshallah, we'll stop here. هذا والله أعلم. صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.